So it's been an exciting day. I know that probably you have heard pretty much everything that you can hear about in this DevOps space, right? You heard about AI, you heard about DevOps, you heard about CI/CD, you heard about this fantastic one last time about this hip company. So my job this afternoon is going to be sort of bringing everything together. So let's talk about how we're going to bring it together. So one of the privileges I have, the role I'm playing right now in my career, is that I get to talk to a lot of smart people. So it's not just like random people, right? Really smart people who are doing some really interesting work. So just this spring, I think it was in March, one of my friends who's a CTO for a really large bank, we have heard a lot of bank stories today, for a really large bank in the US called me up. So he had a problem. His problem was very simple. He said, Ajay, here is a problem, right? I have been investing in this thing called DevOps for about 10, 11 years so far. And I have actually jumped on the platform engineering bandwagon. I have an SRE team, global SRE team, who's actually supporting me from an SRE point of view. 24/7, we have the follow the sun model. Now this AI thing has come up, and I've started investing in AI too. So this is great. Now, here is the problem. He said, but even after all of those things, when I walk the aisles, when I go to the office in Manhattan, when I walk the aisles, when I talk to some of the engineers, they say, I don't know, there's something that's not working. So, I asked, what's not working? They're still not happy. So I asked them, have you ever really tried to measure their happiness to make sure that they are indeed happy? I said, yeah. We have used DX. I'm sure you all have heard of things like DX, right? And great tools. There are great software engineering intelligence tools out there. But we have not been able to get the right kind of results. So what I did at that point was start working with his team to try and figure out what was going on and figure out what is the problem, what is actually creating this problem. So the talk today is going to be sort of my analysis of what I did with them. But I'm going to do it in a way that is somewhat going to talk you through the history of how that DevOps evolution has happened so that you can sort of put all your learnings today into this, right? That's what we're going to do. So the first thing that we will do here is we will talk about a real world scenario, what we just talked about. And I'm also going to be showing some click-through demos. So these click-through demos are pretty simple. So if you want to actually use the QR code and use this, you can follow along with me. I'm going to probably go a little bit faster. So if you want to actually scan it and play around yourself while you're listening to me, that's also perfectly fine. But let's actually talk about this particular bank as to what they did. So here is my large banking client. So their challenge is very interesting, right? They got challenges with whatever we heard today. We heard things about compliance. We heard things about governance. We heard things about all kinds of regulatory requirements, right? So this is obviously US-based one. So the kind of challenges they have from a compliance point of view are mostly US-based. But on top of that, they have all the other problems that we spoke about today. The problems like slower deployment. They have golden paths and things are supposed to work great, but things aren't working great. All those things are there. But on the other hand, we have this newer interesting problems, right? All these newer technologies coming in. These fantastic technologies everybody wants to try and use. So how do you start balancing that? So that was the first problem that we're really trying to figure out. So as I started doing this journey, so what I did was that I first went and figured out how did you actually used to do things before you started doing all these advancements? So about 10 years back, how was your deployments? And you're still doing deployments, right? You're still, putting things in production. You're doing things. So how did you used to do that? So what I found out was that they had some kind of a flow like this. So essentially, they were actually having the developer committing the code, and after that, some deployment pipelines were created. So essentially, all the steps that you can see there were happening. But as you can see, this took about, close to 5 hours, 4 hours and 43 minutes to do it. So that was their real friction, right? They had a huge requirement of probably deploying multiple times a day, and they couldn't do it. So what they did at that point was that, okay, let's go ahead and invest in optimizing these things. Let's figure out where the challenges are. I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with value stream mapping. Is there anybody who's not familiar with value stream mapping? if you are familiar with value stream mapping, there are a couple of things that jumps out at you here, right? There are a couple of steps that are extremely time-consuming, extremely friction-high, and those were the areas they started trying to optimize. So what did they do? So they actually implemented some of the platform engineering principles, and they found that by doing that, they were able to actually get the overall deployment time to about 29 minutes. Perfect, right? So they have went from 6 manual steps to 4 automated steps and 2 manual steps. Essentially bring down their 4 hours or 43 minutes of deployment time to about half an hour. Fantastic. But keep in mind that this is actually a happy path. Meaning, if everything goes well, what they would see is something like this. So that is great, but you still have some problems, right? That's why this guy who actually talked to me found that his engineers are not happy. So this was a time in which he was thinking, yeah, we need to fix all of those things, but he couldn't help it. The AI wave came in. So his team started investing into his platforms team started building AI agents and doing all the work. So what happened next? So he had a situation where he started having this AI-driven platform engineering. So essentially what happened in that case was fantastic, right? You brought down that 29 minutes to even 9 minutes. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Only problem with that is, look at the confidence level. There are significant reasons as to why that confidence level is that low. You can probably see some of it there. But the idea is that there is some real challenges when you try and bring in AI into these kinds of scenarios. These 9 minutes is more than a happy path because he can actually hit 9 minutes far more easier because there is no manual intervention there, right? You're just running things in your lower environments and making sure that things are working. But the problem here is that with that level of confidence from your developer community, from your governance community, from your security teams, you're never really going to put anything in production. So what did they try to do? So at that point, they said, okay, let me actually go and try and do another activity, which is essentially have a supervised AI. So with the supervised AI, what they were able to do is that, my time is actually going to increase a little bit more. From 9 minutes, it's actually going to 15 minutes, but I'm interjecting 2 more expert review steps in there. Isn't that fantastic, right? So if you're doing that, look at the confidence level. Confidence level increases drastically. So this is great, but you are still not able to get the engineers to be happy. So what is actually going on here? So the rest of the conversation today, we are actually going to be talking about 4 of these patterns that's actually making sure that how do we actually figure out why is these kinds of optimization not creating happy developers? And so let's jump right back into our presentation. And as I said, feel free to play around with this. It's a live demo. You can feel free to take a look at it. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll start with the evolutionary context, right? How did we actually came about? So just like this bank did, we are actually going to follow their journey. We'll look at the evolutionary context. Then we'll talk about some of the ongoing challenges. And after that, we'll talk about some of these patterns that we talk about. These are going to be simple patterns, but if you don't have these patterns implemented, you're definitely going to have challenges. And many of the speakers spoke about these patterns earlier today. So then we'll look a little bit at the future of autonomous patterns, right? So essentially what is happening is, if you look at the evolutionary context, I think earlier today we were talking about when did DevOps Days start and all that. So around 2009, 2010 time frame, some really interesting do-it-yourself DevOps activities started coming, right? So we stopped doing this institutional knowledge of people knowing things over time and trying to implement that, having to go to people and asking them for things. We actually changed that to more codified ways of doing it. So that actually started, maybe around 15 years back or something. Pretty soon, we had some phenomenal work happening, right? We had Continuous Delivery by Dave Farley coming out, and we had Phoenix Project coming out. We had Keith's work on infrastructure as code came out in 2015 or so. But one of the most significant things that happened was containers and Kubernetes and those kinds of things started happening around that time. And that's changed almost everything, right? Because our ability to create what we call as platforms today, or the engineering platforms today. We will try and define that a little bit later. But those things became far more easier to build. So that made sure that we could actually see there is a way to create a set of capabilities that we could call as a product for your DevOps activities. So it's not like DevOps being replaced by anything, but could you actually create a set of capabilities that can help it? So that became that second part. Now, fast forward a few more years. So you reached the point where you had some amazing work happening with the Accelerate book. Can I have a quick show of hands? Is there anybody who's not familiar with the Accelerate book? Looks like all of you are, right? Yeah, so there's some phenomenal work happening there. And then we spoke about team topologies multiple times today. That's another work. So some really interesting work started happening. And Backstage also came up with this framework for creating these portals, and which actually made sure that you could actually create a better experience for your developers, right? Your developers aren't always trying to do your API-driven or a CLI-driven ways of doing things. You can create a better experience. You can also start really addressing some of the other personas, not just the developers, but you could really look at it and say, can I actually get my security teams, my governance teams to actually use some of these capabilities that you're producing? So that came about, that self-service activities became far more prevalent about 5 years back or something. Then came those, again, coming back to last year, those whole intelligent platforms thing came out. So that demo I was showing you, that use case I was showing you, became far more popular, last year. And this year, the whole interest and whole conversation has been around, how do you actually make it all completely autonomous? How do you actually throw a bunch of agents to make it all work? And there are people who are attempting to do that within the platform engineering and the DevOps space today. If you really look at the industry, there are tools that are out there that is claiming to do everything automatically for you. You could just go in and make natural language input and everything would just come out that way. But that's the holy grail. That's what people are trying to get to. But the challenge is that even if you were to do all of those things, the problem that I talked about from my friend, that remains. Your developer happiness isn't sort of improving just by doing that. So there are a few things that you need to do to get there. So, Corey talked about the book that we just published. I'm going to use a bunch of excerpts from the book. The book is available and the QR code is also available outside. So first thing that we wanted to do at this point was just sort of define platform engineering. When I talk to people, when I listen to podcasts and all that, one thing I keep hearing is that, platform engineering is this culture, or platform engineering is this new thing that is replacing DevOps. Or it is none of that, right? Let's be very clear as to what it is, and let's talk about in the larger context of how this all comes together, right? So one thing we wanted to do first was, in the book, we are talking about this in detail. We're saying, what is an engineering platform versus platform engineering? So from our definition, engineering platform is essentially that, a system that brings together your infrastructure, governance, and operation technologies so that development teams can use that far more easily and with less friction. That's the idea. So if your strategy is to overcome those fundamental challenges that we've been talking about so far, then what is platform engineering? It's a craft that sort of produces the engineering platform. So if you try and define it that way, it becomes far more easier for you to say that this is what platform engineering is, and this is where it really does not tie in with everything else that we are talking about or replace anything else. So this is another piece of information that might be useful for some of you at least. We have this in the book in detail, described in far more detail. The biggest mistake that a lot of the people make is trying to say that, we hear all these buzzwords. We had this great buzzwords presentation prior to this, right? These buzzwords, whether you call DevOps a buzzword, or whether you call SRE a buzzword, or platform engineering a buzzword, or DevX a buzzword. The problem is sometimes we don't quite understand and try and say that these are specific things within this larger scheme of things. So if you think of DevOps as a cultural paradigm, which nobody disagrees with, that is the way you should be doing things, having better communication between all your stakeholders in your SDLC, then you need something that can actually enable DevOps. And that's what platform engineering is. That is a set of capabilities that can enable DevOps. Similarly, when you talk about SRE, which sort of predates all of these things, what is happening? So if you're applying those software engineering principles to the production, then you really need to have that practice being supported by the right kind of tools and technologies and capabilities to be able to do that. So that is platform engineering. Now, the latest buzzword in that space is DevX, right? So I've had people ask me, isn't DevX replacing platform engineering kind of thing, right? Just like, I was joking with somebody else earlier today that one of the, clients I talked to, they asked me like, Cursor is my new platform. So I'm sorry, right? I mean, there is something wrong there. So again, DevX, the idea is that if you're going to do DevX, you need to make sure that you have the right kind of capabilities that can ensure that the developer experience is improved. So, and multiple people talked about team topologies today. I just want to make a reference to that, right? The whole idea is that you can apply these team topologies ideas, and if you haven't read this book, you should definitely read it. And you can just Google team topologies and get that. This is an absolute must-read for anybody in the DevOps space. The idea is that you can actually apply that people side of things into the platform engineering far more better if you can actually start looking at team topologies. So it's a very simple concept, right? So if you're really saying that platform engineering is essentially an activity where it becomes that primary consumer for the DevX, and it's a reliability partner from an SRE point of view. So if you look at it that way, you can see that platform engineering is that service that is provided for both of these things, or any of these things. So that puts these things in a context that is far more easier for us to understand. So what exactly is the scope of platform engineering? I think one of the bigger problems I've seen is that sometimes when you just use these buzzwords, we're not entirely clear as to what's that scope. Is platform engineering everything, or is it something versus the other? From our point of view, there are 7 critical components to platform engineering. So those 5 horizontal planes that you see there. Those bottom 2 ones, the security and networking connectivity ones, don't need to talk about it, right? Because that is the fundamental part of anything to do with building the capabilities that's needed for improving the developer's experience or any of the stakeholders' experience. So if you don't understand that part, you're not really going to be doing DevOps right? But the other things that actually get a lot of attention, if you look at the developer plane, this is where we talk about things like your version control, or your IAC, your IDE, even your developer portals and things like that falls in there. Your compliance and governance plane, you see the way I've called it out. I have not called out a separate CI/CD or a pipeline or things like that. The reason for that is that from our definition point of view, pipelines should be owned by the developers. So they are the people who are building it, they own it. But what are we providing them? We are providing them those NFRs that's going to ensure that the right kind of compliance and right kind of capabilities are being used right. So now the part that gets most attention in all our conversations is the containers and the runtime and the Kubernetes part of it. So that's that delivery and runtime plane there. But all these things are interesting, but let's actually look at that 2 vertical planes too. So on the left side that you see this observability plane, so this is something that we have talked about a lot. When we talk about monitoring and observability, there is a natural tendency to talk about these things in the context of, okay, so let's talk about monitoring our application. Let's observe our application or observe our infrastructure. That is fundamentally wrong. You have to think about observability in a larger context. So when you think about observability, you have to think about across multiple axes, everything starting from your portfolio observability. How is the set of products that's actually going to go? How is your cloud working? We've been having lots of stories about AWS and Azure outages recently. So let's look at it holistically across the board and see how this observability sort of tells you a story. And with the advent of AI, I think that's one of the biggest advantages that you could see, right? You could really stitch together a much better story that way. So the most important part, if you ask me, probably the most important part that sort of differentiates platform engineering from a lot of the other things that we do is the idea that it needs to have a product mindset. And a lot of us have actually talked about this over the years. So I think the idea that when you start looking at platforms as products, that's when your engineering platforms typically become far more successful. What does that mean, right? It's not a buzzword, because if you really look at it, and this is again from the book, there are some very critical aspects that you think about it. When you start looking at platforms as a product, it will have a life cycle, it'll have the right kind of analytics, it'll have the right kind of user inputs going into it, and it'll have multiple versions. If somebody asks you, if you're working on a platform, and somebody asks you like, hey, when are you going to be done with your platform? Your answer should be never. As long as you have a product, As long as you have your product has users, you'll never be done with building your engineering platform, because your purpose of the engineering platform is to provide that kind of capability to support those products, right? So you'll never be done with that. But this also has a couple of aspects that you should be thinking about. As you're really trying to do the platform product management, are you thinking about the overall experiences that's going to come with it? That platform experiences are the experience that the engineers would get out of it, or the consumers would get out of it. And these are built on typical engineering practices. These engineering practices are no different from creating your domain product versus a platform product, right? Those kinds of principles are going to be exactly the same. And now we talk about the platform domains. I'm not going to go into too much detail around it, but these platform domains are very different from a domain of a BFSI or your banking financial services like we are talking about, or a healthcare or something. These are more along the lines of your cloud identity, more along the lines of control planes, so Keith was talking about earlier today. I mean, so those are the kind of things that we are really talking about from a domains point of view. So I hope this gives you a general idea of like, what's the scope of a platform when we talk about platforms, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the challenges. So this is, going back to my example, so one of the challenges with this particular bank was that they wanted to give a lot of freedom to their developers. So together with the freedom came that fragmentation, right? So when people had a whole lot of freedom, that standardization started going away. Ownership we have been preaching about ownership for a while. So now the ownership has led to this idea of what's the right level of cognitive load? We wanted to actually reduce the cognitive load. If we are trying to reduce the cognitive load, are we actually trying to make sure that they understand and start doing more and more of those things? So the other idea is that everybody, including this bank, has got a need for speed. We all need to actually do the speed. So I could go to cloud code and probably generate 50,000 lines of code in a matter of a day or two, right? So if I'm actually creating that, how much of that code is even maintainable? So I think if you really start looking at those as the challenges, the promise was that you will have a much lesser cognitive load by using platforms, by using DevOps principles, using AI. You can take away all the cognitive load. You can try and make everything far more easier. But that has literally led to the situation with huge tool proliferation, standards becoming inconsistent, which essentially led to that situation of what these guys were actually going through. And if you are thinking that your organizations that you are trying to do aren't there yet, just wait, right? If you don't change and start applying some of these patterns, pretty soon you're going to actually reach that point. So AI is promising, right? So this is not a talk about AI, so I'm not really going to say for or against AI anything here, but at the same time, it's fairly promising, right? In the sense that all these problems that we spoke about, this inconsistent standards, this tool proliferations, there are solutions that AI can provide that is going to be far more effective, right? So we can't discount that fact. Whether you are somebody who's a big fan, big fan of AI, or somebody who's not somewhat on the fence, it doesn't matter, right? There are things that AI can help with this. But the question that you should be asking is like, who are you actually building this for, and why are you building this for? I think these questions came up multiple times today. So the developer's role, whether we agree with it or not today, is sort of moving away from that operator role to a supervisor role. If you just think about it, right? What we used to do was to build platform capabilities. Developers would actually take the capabilities and run with it. Now, if you're saying that these capabilities are going to be a lot more autonomous, a lot more smarter, it can figure out what might be happening and do it for you. If that's the case, is a developer more of as a supervisor? So I think if you really look at it that way, then you can figure out that, yeah, this is not exactly the kind of world that we used to live in the past. So let's look at these patterns quickly. So what are these patterns that we are talking about? So there are 4 patterns that we will talk about. So golden paths, control planes, domain APIs, and supervised AI. And this is not something that is, that I just came up with out of thin air, right? These are situations where you have to standardize things, you have to start orchestrating it, contextualize it, and then automate it. So if you look at it that way, these are the 4 patterns that you should always be thinking about. So golden paths, fairly simple, right? So here what we are trying to do is abstract complexity, really trying to provide those standardized ways of doing things. When you talk about golden paths, always think about those escape hatches too. Not everybody would be able to live with those 80% of the cases, right? So think about those escape hatches that can help you get to where you want to get to for your power users. But more important than what exactly golden path is, whatever heck you are trying to do, let's make sure that you understand the business value. Your business can add the value. So your KPIs might be different than what you might be seeing here, which is perfectly fine, but you need to have those KPIs. So if you're trying to apply any of these patterns without the kind of KPIs, therein lies the problem. So the example I gave you in the beginning, their biggest problem was that they were trying to do all the right things, but they did not have the right KPIs and they were not measuring the right things. So the QR code here should actually let you see this demo. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that live demo here, but you should be able to scan the QR code and see that demo. So if you really look at the next pattern, the control planes, so this is where you're actually translating. You might have heard the name control plane. You might be knowing everything about control plane, but if you're not familiar, very simple idea, right? How do you translate that developer intent to those infrastructure solutions that you want to build? Now, and how do you actually make sure that happens, right? And in order for you to do that, there are examples. I know we spoke about these examples in the earlier presentations too, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but in the demo you can actually see a lot of these very specific examples. And business value of control planes is just as important. So everything else that you're trying to do, make sure that you actually see why you want the control plane and how are you actually measuring the success of each of these control plane activities. And again, feel free to look at this demo. The one thing I want to call out here is sometimes people ask, like, aren't all these control planes now getting completely automated with AI? Why do I even have to worry about contextually? I can understand what might be happening. The automation can understand what's happening, and it can do it for you. Probably not, right? So because anything that you're trying to do in the AI space, you need to have that execution interface, and that's where control planes come in. The third one is a domain API. So these are the domains where you're really trying to see, like, how do you actually make sure that your product developers, they are the people who understand the domain. And whether they understand infrastructure or not is less important. They should understand that. Every developer should have some level of understanding of how infrastructure works, but you don't really want them to think about it. So would you not really let them do their work through the kind of interfaces that can provide you that connection from the domain that they're working on to the infrastructure side of things? So that's a third pattern that we see a lot. And this is the business value aspect of it is no less important. If you can't really figure out, if you're providing those APIs to translate some of the requirements for creating a payment gateway or something into the infrastructure side of things, if you can't really measure those things, then your success is going to be limited in that space. Again, there is a demo for this one. So for each of these patterns, you can actually see the demo. If you scan the QR code, you should be able to see the demo. And the domain APIs, how do you actually articulate this in the world of AI? Think of it like the knowledge framework, right? This is where the actual knowledge that translates your domain information to the infrastructure side of things. So the last pattern that we will finish with is the idea of supervised AI. So I call this supervised AI as opposed to an agentic AI or anything else, mainly because this is where we are really struggling right now, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done with agents, but we are definitely struggling with the fact that this isn't moving as fast as you want it to. It's not really building the right level of confidence. So some of the examples of this that every company that I know of today, especially the services industry, right, they do all these 4 things. So everybody is trying to build their own solutions for improving their ticket management and improving the operational efficiency and all that kind of things. And the way they do it is that they end up building agents, right? I mean, so they actually build agents for all of these things. Then you have a situation where your multi-agent scenarios, everything that actually is coming together in that space. So again, when you look at the supervised AI, look at it from the point of view of what's that business value that it's going to bring in. All right, so we talked about these core principles of platform evolution, the idea of building this incrementally, then prioritizing people, focusing on the value as well as continuous learning. Make sure that you take these to the bank, right? These are the things that's really going to make sure that the patterns that we spoke about, how do you measure these things, and that these things actually come together well. So how does the future look at this point, right? So the idea should be that I'm not saying that you should use AI or you shouldn't use AI, right? That's up to you, and you might have your own decisions for that. But what we are seeing today is more of that, right? What we are seeing is that we have an AI-first way of doing it. How about we actually move that into this patterns-first way of doing it, build the platforms right, then apply AI to it. That is going to provide you far more better results down the road. So again, the idea is that I think this is something, you might think that this is a slide that is stolen from a lot of the other slides that you saw earlier today, but the idea is that make your engineering platform the foundation for AI. That is the way you have to really think about this. So we recently came out with a State of AI in Platform Engineering report. If you haven't read this, definitely take a read. You can scan the QR code, take a read of this. This will tell you a lot of the very interesting data that you might be seeing in this presentation as well as in the industry as a whole. And this is something that we have seen multiple times. You know, the AI, this is from that report. You can't really stop the wave of AI. I mean, so what we are really seeing is that the AI adoption has crossed the chasm, right? We can see that there is significant usage within the space, but at the same time, make sure that you are able to support the developers who are actually using AI at that level. So just to finish up the conversation, so if you haven't heard about the book, there is actually a QR code right when you exit this auditorium, but you can also scan this as well as use these discount codes if you want to. There are some raffle, the books that's going to be given out from a raffle later today, but if you're not one of those raffle winners, you can definitely try and scan this and get a discount. If you want to connect with me down the road, here are my coordinates, and thank you so much.